What is up, everyone? Welcome to, I guess, playoff week one, we'll call it, of the absolutely epic early week podcast. It might be considered sub-epic now because we skipped a week. Last week was crazy with travel and schedules and all that. We intended to get it in and then did not. Turns out it might have been a good
That's
thing.
what she said.
Turns out might have been a good thing. The newest millionaire in DFS, probably the first millionaire of 2017, is a man by the name of, apologies if I get this wrong, Josh Virink. Probably butchered that. But anyhow, Josh said in an interview on RotoGrinders, he starts his week with the absolutely epic early week podcast. I can't imagine that we help Josh out too much. So, Josh, you're welcome for not recording last week. And hopefully that contributed to your $1 million win. Which brings us to Bobby Fye, who was one player off from winning the million this last weekend. Bobby, in spite of that, how are you doing?
I guess in spite of that, it's good. I haven't after my nice little 12-day Christmas vacation, I've come back. I have not had one losing day at DFS. I've been kind of sick, so losing a little bit at life, but happy about the new year and really, really happy about the way basketball is looking. Just wish I would have been able to end the season on a massive note, end the regular season on a massive note. Had a real chance Sunday, but didn't quite come through.
But it really doesn't hurt that much because Josh won and he's a listener, right?
I mean, yeah, I don't know if it doesn't hurt $998,000 worth, but it doesn't. It hurts a little less. That was nice to hear. Thanks for listening.
Also, quick question. If you had to decide between being sick every day for the next 6 months, but winning at DFS every one of those days, or being healthy and having just a normal stretch, which would you take?
It all depends on the amount.
Okay, but you're profitable every day for 6 months.
If I'm profitable every day for 6 months, God, that would be crazy. I play almost only tournaments these days. Wow. 6 months is a long time. I just turned 35. I don't know if I want to give up 6 months. That's a lot to give up, but I would do it. Maybe I would do it.
31. I guess 31 is young enough that I would miss 6 months with sickness for that. But
I don't know.
All right, we're gonna bring in our third member, and that is Grant. Even though it's playoffs, we're still gonna have a Grant rant. So, Grant, what do you have for us this week?
Well, first of all, I think you're kind of describing prostitution. If you're making money for 6 months, but you're probably getting sick out of it, there could be some slight connotations between the two. But in any case, just wanted to give everyone late advice for New Year's. Every single New Year's on the 31st, before midnight, do something incredibly dumb because it's the last time you could do that year. And then on the 1st, go and do something incredibly dumb so your standards can only go up from there. Every single year, I start out trying to get a girl that is less than adequate standards or over double my age. Immediately once midnight starts, I try and eat some terrible food. I get a little bit too intoxicated, and I get incredibly sick on the 1st and 2nd every single year and just hate my life. So there's nowhere to go but up. Hashtag, it's all about the future.
So today is a much better day than yesterday, and tomorrow will be even better than today. Is that right?
Yeah, and also don't start your New Year's resolution until February 1st. It's just a dumb thing to do because you're going to see everyone else fail, and you can say at mid-February, I have held hold to my resolutions this entire time I've had them.
I love the things that you come up with off the top of your head, including the accusation of prostitution. I don't know that I've ever met anyone else whose mind works quite like yours. The beauty of that is we're going to wait to dole out punishment from the last bold calls, but longtime listeners know we have to get creative in what would actually embarrass Grant, given that normal tweets do not harm him as they harm a mere mortal. So we have some good stuff later on in that regard. But first, we're going to get to some football. And this week, we're going to take a unique approach. As always, these are our early week thoughts. As always, you're more likely to win $1 million if you don't follow our early week advice. But whatever, people seem to like us, so we keep it going. This week, we're going to talk about all 4 games one at a time and just kind of talk about what we see each offense doing, what level of success we see with each team. So before we get into that real quickly, I'm going to ask each of you if you take a different approach in playoff DFS or if it's pretty much business as usual. Grant, I mean, you play a lot of cash games. What are your thoughts on week one of playoff DFS? Do you still play a lot of cash games? Do you kind of go tournament heavy or what?
I'd like to do tournaments a little bit more because here's the thing: in week one, week two playoffs, the chalk is going to be pretty heavy because it's a 2 to 4 game sample size every single week. So what you want to do is you want to stay mostly chalky with 1 or 2 off the board plays. Like there are plays that should not have that drastic of a ownership difference. Like a guy that should be probably 10K owned is more like 2 or 10% owned is more like 2% owned. And so I really like playing it and just basically going for the chalky plays with 1 or 2 off guys that I just get and doing a ton of research and figure out. So it's one of those where you can actually look at past ownership too and kind of know, and then look at what they've done the past few weeks. And if there's nothing there, then you're going to realize that there are a lot of people that are just playing playoff football or DFS and just to dick around, and no one's really going to think about the guys that, oh, he hasn't done anything for 2 weeks, I don't want him, even though there's a reason for that and there's a rationale behind it.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. I'm glad that we actually started out with this want another thing that, I probably wouldn't have even remembered had we not started talking about this is, I talk a lot about wanting to make sure everybody on my team has a shot at 20 points. I don't want to take the 3K guy who's going to get me 9 points because then you need that 9K guy to get you, 35 or 40 points for it to all really work out. So basically you want everybody to have 20 point upside, with a ceiling even higher than that. Playoff football is a little bit different because you have less to work with. I remember last year or the year before I had a really profitable weekend using James Starks. Even though Eddie Lacy was the lead back, just because the Packers generally gave 6 to 8 touches to James Starks each game, and he was, bottom barrel salary, and you can get 6 or 7 points out of that and then load up on some of the more expensive guys. So I think the strategy is a little bit different too. Bobby, what's your take on these playoff slates?
I love the playoff slates in general. I think I've made more money consistently in the playoffs of both NBA and NFL than I have during any regular season. Last year, I think it was last year. Owen Daniels won me like $100,000 just because on both sides, I knew he'd be the lowest owned. There was 3 great tight ends going that day. Peyton Manning's little gimpy arm. And I think he had 2 touchdown catches in the first quarter. Didn't do much after that, but it was enough. I paired him with Gronkowski on DraftKings. I remember that. And they both had massive games. And I think that they're so much fun because all you have to do is find the 1 or 2 contrary picks. And that one guy goes off. Jermaine Kearse one year won me a ton of money because he was like 1.5% owned. He was in 75% of my lineups that day. And he ended up having like 30 fantasy points. It's just finding those little value plays and figuring out some sort of game flow of how a situation could play out could make you a ton of money, and you can forget about filling your whole salary or doing anything like that. You just find a good spot that's a little bit contrary with mostly chalk, and you're going to be good.
Yeah, I think that's great advice because, chalk really does flow heavily into certain directions on these weekends. And if you can find the play, basically looking like we're going to try to start with tonight, and that should be everybody's process throughout the week, is how each team is likely to approach it. Because if you can find, one team that the 1 or 2 players that a defense is going to sell out to take out in a playoff game, and know that the defense will be able to do that, you can start looking elsewhere where everybody else is just looking kind of on the surface. And you can start looking at, okay, who's actually going to get the production in these games that people are not thinking about. So a great way to start with that is the first game of the weekend, and that's Oakland at Houston. The over-under is currently pegged at 36.5, which might be the lowest over-under we've had all season. We might have had one earlier this year with like 33 points or something, but I mean, it's up there with the lowest over-unders we've had on the whole season. So this is a spot where a lot of people won't be looking in DFS, which means this is a spot where we should be looking and kind of digging in to see, okay, is there anything truly usable here? Let's start with the Houston offense, which I think is a little more attractive. And we're looking at, an Oakland defense that's 18th in DVOA against the run, 25th against the pass. We know that they struggle with faster receivers, which would be Will Fuller. We know that they can be had on the ground. I think Lamar Miller had 24 carries for 104 yards against them earlier this year, and that was at altitude, Mexico City. So I kind of see the Texans, a couple of weeks ago, they had, I believe it was against the Lions, that Alfred Blue had over 20 carries and Lamar Miller had over 20 carries. And I kind of think we're going to see something similar this week where they're just going to ride the ground game, with some shots sprinkled in. Definitely think that there's some yardage upside to be found on this Houston side of the ball. CJ Fedorowicz, I think Alfred Blue could be used as the cheap guy who can get you yards if he gets, 14, 15 carries. So, Grant, I'm going to start with you. I guess not start with you because I kind of started, but bring you in here for your thoughts on the Houston offense against Oakland.
So the Houston offense, I really don't have that much interest in them. I mean, it's Savage. I think he's in concussion protocol right now, and so Osweiler might start if he starts. I mean, Oakland's not a great defense, but they're not really worth it. And you have multiple quarterbacks on the slate that are going to be able to give you guaranteed points pretty much. And so I don't really have any interest in going towards him, but Fuller is a guy that can be a bit of an interesting pick because he does have the game-breaking ability to go for 60, 70 yards. And when you're working on a 4-game slate, that's kind of what you want to target because there's not going to be a ton of guys scoring over 20 points. And he's a guy that's fairly cheap and can break one off. So everyone's going to be going with the chalk at Bell, Brown, Odell Beckham this week. So going off for a low-price guy with Fuller, who may still be kind of high-owned, you can kind of deal with that because of how many points he can just accumulate in such a short amount of time. I mean, Osweiler had a game week 2 or week 4, something like that, where Fuller had 15, 20 points in the first quarter. And so I'm interested in him. And then, Lamar Miller, I think, could be a decent play in a week where there's not really many good running backs to go to. And I don't think a lot of people are going to be going with a full 3 running back set with a running back at the flex. So he's not a bad way to go. But other than that, those 2 guys are the only ones I really have much interest in this week. So,
Bobby, what about you? And then any thoughts on Brock Osweiler's been bad all year, but he was better the first few weeks of the season than what he turned into down the stretch. Any thoughts that maybe getting benched and having that week off kind of helped Osweiler reset mentally? I mean, he did look better last week than he had in the weeks leading up to that.
Yeah, maybe. I still think he's the worst quarterback in the NFL. Having said that, I think that you can definitely target Houston's passing game this week. I think that there's just just the number of targets DeAndre Hopkins is getting is worth a look for sure against a Raiders secondary that's actually pretty good on the outside. But still, I think that Hopkins, you're looking for that one sort of more contrary play. He's a guy who has that huge game ability. I think Fuller makes sense. I think that because of the Raiders' trouble over the middle, Fedorowicz probably would be an interesting counterplay in what will be a low-scoring game. I'm not really overly overwhelmed with this game as a whole. I know we didn't really get into the Oakland side of the ball, but there's only one spot I'm looking as another contrary play. It's mostly a game that I'm thinking about fading even on this little 4-game slate.
You bring up a good point too about the Oakland corners on the outside doing well. And actually, let me pull up the numbers because Oakland is very strong on the outside and very weak over the middle. And most people don't realize that. So right now, Oakland is ranked 12th and 11th on the left and right side of the offense, respectively, in DVOA, and ranked 27th over the middle. So over the middle is really where they get hurt the most, which means Fedorowicz really does become a viable target in this one. So and obviously this Houston side is, it's going to be the lowest Vegas implied total on the weekend. It's not something people are supposed to be excited about, but I do think that there are plays worth looking at. It'll be interesting this week to try to unravel whether Houston plans to use Lamar Miller as a bell cow and give him 30 touches, or if they're going to balance it out between Miller and Blue, because I do think they'll ride the running backs here, and either Miller becomes spectacularly valuable if he's getting 30 touches, or Blue becomes a good option if he's going to fill in for 12, 15 touches of his own. On the Oakland side, It's a little interesting. I mean, I don't want to trust the passing game in the hands of whoever is going to end up under center. The Raiders seem to want McGloin to be able to get in there, but it doesn't look like his shoulder will be ready. Today they were saying that Connor Cook was running plays that he hadn't even run in practice before. It's kind of a mess, and I plan to stay away from the passing game in this one. I do think the running situation is somewhat interesting, only in so far as Vince Wilfork's had a bad season stopping the run. Houston 17th in DVOA against the run, and Jack Del Rio made some comments today that seemed to imply that he wants the team to recommit to Latavius Murray. So if we hear a little bit more on that throughout the week, Murray could be interesting. But Bobby, give me your thoughts on this Oakland offense. Am I missing anything? I know Grant will probably tell us Seth Roberts, but outside of that, do you have any interest on this side of the ball?
I am extremely interested in Latavius Murray and what I still think will be a way under-owned spot. I think it's a guy who's got 35 fantasy point potential in this kind of a matchup against a Houston defense that's really increasingly gotten worse against the run all season long. It's just a matter of how many touches he gets. That you can't really look at that last game against Denver because they fell down so big so fast. And they were playing the 3 running back approach, but it was a little bit different. This is their season on the line. I think they're going to be able to run the ball, and I think that I really like Lat Murray, especially if he's going to be in the 7 to 10% owned or less, which I think he will be as of this moment. I don't know. I think he's a really good spot to look at.
It's pretty incredible on these playoff slates. And if you haven't played them before, any listeners, you'll see it this weekend. Pay attention to it. But it's incredible how low owned some players are on a 4-game slate. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, like Latavius Murray as a starting running back, one of 8 starting running backs on the weekend could conceivably be, 5, 6, 7% owned. Even those last 2 games where they recommitted to this 3-back backfield, he got 13 carries and 15 carries. He also had 1 and 2 catches in those. That's 14 touches and 17 touches. I mean, that's what Devontae Freeman gets every week is 17 touches. So Latavius Murray is half the talent that Devontae Freeman is, but he has one of the 2 best offensive lines in football. And if he gets 17 touches, I like my chances with him as a tournament play. Grant, what are your thoughts on the Oakland offense? Are you using Seth Roberts this week?
I hate to say it, but no. Real sad. But I think there's actually a lot of things that you really need to look into this and take into account the kind of slate that it is as a 4-game slate. So the first thing I want to mention is that Jalen Richard, whatever the hell his name is, and Washington are both viable plays if they don't say that they're going to be going to Murray this week, because both of them have the ability to break off a 40, 50-yard reception and get 4 or 5 receptions out of the backfield. I think the last game they played against Houston, they accounted for 3 of the team's receiving touchdowns, 2 of the team's receiving touchdowns, and they really gave it to the running backs out of the backfield a very, very large amount. And then the next thing you need to know is that if McGloin does look like he's healthy, he didn't have that bad of stats when he played his rookie year. I think he was averaging almost 240 yards a game, and he had much, much, much more subpar wide receivers than he does now, I believe. And on top of that, the offensive line wasn't nearly what it was this week. You also take into account that they just went up against the toughest pass defense in the entire league, maybe in the league history. And so people are going to immediately see how bad he was last week, not realizing that he only had 1 week in the offense, and on top of that, it was against a tough matchup. So this is going to keep a ton of ownership off of Crabtree, Cooper. So I think you can go with either of those guys too, and they could have the potential to pay off huge, especially on full point PPR sides.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, as far as looking for, you're talking about guys who are going to be low owned, elite players who are going to be low owned on a 4-game slate. Cooper and Crabtree both fit that bill. Tough to pull the trigger with a second or third string quarterback against a good pass defense, but those are the sorts of plays that end up winning you a tournament on this weekend. Also, DeAndre Washington has 9, 13, and 6 touches the last 3 weeks. So agree on him. I mean, if he gets 13, 14 touches again, there's a lot of upside there. Bobby, any final thoughts on this spot before we move on?
Yeah, I could see an argument being made. I think Crabtree's the better of the two if you're going to pick one of him or Cooper.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to go to either spot, but I don't agree with anyone else. The other running backs. What just happened?
Cat fell down. Another cat was drinking water and broke the water bowl.
Oh, damn it.
So
Cats, right,
Well,
guys?
with that, I guess that's like a little like bell. Maybe we should move on to the next game.
yeah, that's the bell. Move on to the next game. Yeah, one of my cats is trying to play with a toy that makes a lot of noise, so I tried to block her from it. She fell. Set off a crazy chain of events.
Wait,
So
that's Jan.
yeah, moving on as water moves toward my feet and get me soaking wet. The next game is I just lost it on my phone. What's the next game on Saturday? There we go. Detroit and Seattle. Detroit at Seattle, which is a 42.5 over under. Seattle is already favored by 8 points. I'm sure Grant loves that. If you pay attention to my Twitter feed, you know that I think this is Seattle's year and Tom Brady's awful. So, Grant, I want to let you kick off this one. For new listeners, that was an embarrassing tweet I had to post for losing the bold call. I don't actually think that. Grant, what are your thoughts on the Seattle offense against this Detroit defense? I mean, Detroit has their whole thing this year has been slowing down the pace and preventing offenses from having the ball a lot. Is that going to impact Seattle negatively? I think Seattle's like bottom 3 or 4 in the league in runs and plays per game already. So what are your thoughts on Seattle at home?
Yeah, it definitely impacts them negatively, but that doesn't really matter. There's a 4-game slate. Even with a negative impact, they're still going up against a 32 ranked defense in terms of DVOA against the pass. And people forget this. Russell Wilson has had 3 or more touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. The only one he didn't get 3 touchdowns against was San Francisco. They are a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, or vice versa, whatever. I can't remember which one's which. But they are a team that can go one way or another, and they always seem to keep pace with the other team. So it's always a good idea to keep in mind that a game stack is a possibility here. Maybe not use Stafford, but I think that you can use any one of the wide receivers on the other side or even Zenner. But we'll get to that in a second. In terms of Seattle's offense, I think this is some of the best sleeper plays of the entire slate. So Paul Richardson is basically coming into this offense as a replacement for Tyler Lockett. And he was a second-round pick a few years ago. He's got game-changing speed, and he can go off for a big bomb at any given time. And he's going to be near, 3% owned, 1% owned, if that. He's 3,400, and he has a chance at 15 to 20 points, which on a slate like this at that ownership is incredible. So
hold on. I gotta get Bobby in here on that, like 1.35% ownership projection. I mean, if he's that low owned, he's got to be on like 100% of your rosters, right? I mean, Bobby, what do you see for Paul Richardson ownership?
My guess would be like more in the 15 to 20% range.
Okay, never mind then. Well, I feel dumb.
But
no, I know. I think he had 7
crazy,
targets last week. He had 5 the week before when Lockett went down. I think people are paying attention, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. If you're a premium subscriber, Chris Jimino's ownership projections are extremely accurate. So if you're seeing Richardson toward the end of the week, even at 8 or 10%, I mean, I think that's a jump on board spot for sure. I just wonder if it'll be that low.
Yeah, I doubt it.
Also, one thing to keep in mind: play on a certain site where ownership comes out immediately once the game starts, and you can take guys in and out on DraftKings based on ownership this weekend. I probably shouldn't have given away that secret, but if anyone listens to this website, hopefully you win money because of that. But yeah, also, I guess Curse is a good option. Baldwin's obviously a good option because since he can go for 3 touchdowns at any time. I love Wilson, but he's going to be one of the chalkier plays on the slate. One guy that I think no one will be on who has a possibility for a good enough game to really help you out is Luke Wilson at minimum price. And I think 10% of his total catches in his entire NFL career are for touchdowns. And him and Russell Wilson actually have a pretty good connection. He was injured for a lot this year, and he seems to be a little bit more looked at by Russell Wilson in the last few weeks, where I am going to be on him a little bit just because there aren't a lot of good tight ends on the slate, and he's one that's going to be near 0% owned who has a chance to go for 10 points.
Yeah, I think that's interesting with Lockett out that maybe we see a few more Lockett had just passed Curse in 2 wide sets before that, before Lockett got hurt. And so I think we could maybe see a little bit more 2 tight end. Luke Wilson had 3 targets last week, which is interesting. Bobby, what's your take on this Seattle offense and any thoughts on this Seattle running game?
I don't know. I'm sort of iffy on the running game at this moment. I'm not really interested in committing to it, but I do think that it's a good spot to target as a potential game stack. If you want to take a semi-game stack, maybe take Wilson and one of the receivers, maybe Richardson, and you could even take Richardson and Baldwin and take somebody that maybe even like an Ebron on the other side. One spot Seattle doesn't defend quite as well historically, but still, it's just an interesting spot to maybe throw a game stack or 2 in if you're playing a bunch of lineups. But it's not something I'm looking for guaranteed production. I do think Richardson is an obvious play that I'm going to be using a lot on DraftKings because of that price, and it's hard to find value. But I don't really have like a ton of interest in using anybody from this game for cash other than maybe Wilson.
Yeah, I think Paul Richardson's definitely a strong play at 3,400. If he's going to get funneled 7 targets, then that's obviously huge at that price on PPR sites in particular. I think that a couple other things to keep in mind are, one, Detroit's run defense ratings are not good, but they've allowed, I don't know what the number is now after they faced Ezekiel Elliott, but before that game, they were second in the NFL in rushing touchdowns, or first in the NFL in rushing touchdowns allowed to running backs. So they're elite at stopping running backs from scoring. And I as somebody who we were talking before the show about, using a strong core and mass entering the Millie Maker. And I was saying how I had Ertz on my team. On most of my teams, I had DeAndre Hopkins on most of my teams. Cardinals defense on all my teams, but I also had Rawls on most of my teams against the 49ers pathetic run defense. And people could say, oh, Rawls got rested once the Seahawks had a lead and Atlanta was blowing out the Saints, so the game didn't matter anymore, blah, blah, blah. But when Rawls was in there, he was still splitting snaps with Alex Collins. He didn't look good against one of the worst run defenses in history. So I think Rawls will probably draw, just spitballing early week, 15 to 20% ownership, just because you got to play running backs. And people think of Detroit as a bad run defense. I think Rawls is a fade for me. And that also brings us to, Grant talked about game stacks. Grant, as a Seattle fan, will hate to hear this, but it is undeniably true that since Earl Thomas went down, this has been a very, very different pass defense. Seattle has tumbled all the way to 13th in DVOA against the pass. That puts them behind Carolina, who people still think they should be picking on. That puts them right next to Miami. That puts them right next to Cincinnati, Dallas. These are not elite pass defenses. And I think we're going to get Detroit passing offense at pretty low ownership. And so, Grant, I'll start with you as a Seattle fan. What's your level of interest in this Detroit passing game? And then also talk to me about Zach Zenner just from a usage standpoint. How cheaply you can get that usage this week.
Yeah, so I think Zenner's in play, although I hate against the Seattle run defense, which they've had one of the best run defenses the last 2 years in a row. And I think they're ranked 2 in DVOA against the run. But yeah, you're right. It actually is true. With Earl Thomas out of the line, or him in the lineup, they are significantly worse against the pass. It was the same thing with Cam Chancellor out of the lineup. I think they allowed 7-8 more points through the air without Chancellor in the lineup. They rely so much on those safeties, and without them in the lineup, it really just tears down their pass defense. And so this is going to be a game where it's a 42.5 over under, but we've seen the Seahawks go with 15 points total in the game against the Vikings last year. Granted, that was in weather. And then against Carolina, they ended up scoring 40 and lost 45-40, something like that. This is a team that can give up a significant amount of points. We saw against Buffalo. And it's going to be done through the air, and I think that Stafford can do it. I don't know how much I want to use Stafford just because, again, I like some other quarterbacks that are on the slate. But all his receiving options, Tate's kind of expensive at 6,300. But Marvin Jones is only 4,100, and Bolden's only 4,000. Ebron's 3,900 with not a lot of tight ends available. And if they're going to be at low ownership because people believe that the Seattle pass defense is that much better than they really are because Earl Thomas is not in the lineup, then I think that they're a great place to target this weekend.
Yeah, and I mean, people are going to get real, and I don't blame them. I mean, Ben Roethlisberger and Antonio Brown in the playoffs, yeah, give me that all day. But people are going to get excited about that matchup against a Miami pass defense that has been borderline elite for much of the year, and they've fallen down a little bit lately. But people are going to forget that Miami was missing Byron Maxwell last week. And that's a big part of the reason that they just got torched. Byron Maxwell has been a serious difference maker this season. He should be back for the playoffs. I mean, I still like Brown and Bell and everything, but yeah, I mean, to that point, you know, if we want to talk advanced numbers, Miami ranks 14th in DVOA against the pass. Seattle ranks 13th. And yeah, Roethlisberger's a better quarterback in his system than Stafford is in his system from a fantasy perspective. Stafford has the finger thing, all that. But given the gap we'll see in ownership, there's a lot to like in the in this passing game of the Lions. So, Bobby, talk to me about what you're seeing on this side, what you're kind of gravitating toward early in the week.
On the Lions side of the ball?
On the Lions side, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's not somewhere that I'm overwhelmingly in love with, but I do think that Ebron is probably my favorite play in the passing game. He continues to get targets, and he's a big part of that offense. I think that it's a better spot to attack Seattle than some of the others, although I agree that the pass defense is not what it used to be. I still wouldn't go crazy with I don't know. I'm not going to go crazy with this game as of right now, but that may change later in the week. I don't really love anybody other than Ebron, who I do have in a lot of my lineups.
I think one thing to think about here is, or I guess two things. One is Grant mentioned Anquan Boldin, which is just keeping in mind that Boldin is their end zone threat, which carries value against defense that, like we talked about, you know, their weakest spot is defending the tight end. Now with Earl Thomas out, defending the middle of the field, Boldin basically plays a tight end type role in this offense. I do think that he's viable. And I think with Zenner, I don't know if you guys remember this a couple of years ago, or maybe that was just last year, but when last year when Darren McFadden was getting all that pass game work. And I remember a week against Seattle where he was under 4K and was pretty low owned. But if you're going to get 7 or 8 targets, which Zenner hasn't seen yet, but he did see 5 targets last week, that carries some value in PPR. So it's a slightly different situation. Zenner is priced higher than McFadden was last year. He's seeing less pass game work, but definitely something to keep in mind just from a PPR perspective that's a decent salary saver this week, especially with players priced down on DraftKings against the Seahawks. So all good things to keep in mind. And that brings us to our next game, which is the illustrious Steelers offense taking on Miami. And the over-under is 49 or 47. Pittsburgh is already a 10-point favorite. Obviously, this is where everybody wants to look. Grant, what are your thoughts? I mean, is it just Roethlisberger, Brown, and Bell, or are you interested in Ladarius Green and Eli Rogers, or maybe one of these deep threats on this team? What are you thinking?
I mean, I think that Eli Rogers is in play. I'm not hugely on him just because of the fact, what's his price? 4,000. I'd just rather go with other guys at that spot. But this is the week where you can do the full Pittsburgh stack: Bell, Brown, Roethlisberger, and Eli Rogers. And something that you need to keep in mind, or throw Ladarius Green in there instead of Eli. Doesn't really matter, because if Ben's going to go off for a huge game, chances are that those guys are going to score a ridiculous amount of points. And this is at home. Ben Roethlisberger this year has been pretty great at home in almost every single game. I think he has one game with under 3 touchdowns at home this entire year. So it's a pretty safe bet that he's going to be getting 3 touchdowns and probably 250 to 300 yards. So don't overthink this. This is going to be a chalky lineup if you just play Pittsburgh players, but it's not necessarily a terrible one. And you can do a full game stack and then go off the board a little bit with some other picks. And that can be kind of the chalk with a slight bit of contrarian lineup that you can have. But yeah, I think almost everyone's in play.
People kind of equate the word chalk with a bad lineup because, you know, we who do podcasts and shows and write articles, we talk about the chalk plays so often and avoiding the chalk plays so often that it almost gets in our heads, okay, chalk equals bad. But the chalk is a chalk for a reason. Bobby talked about that earlier in the season, especially in football where we have a week to prepare. It makes sense for the chalk to hit somewhat often. And so it's not just fading chalk to fade chalk. I think you have to be strategic about it. And I think if you play Brown, Bell, and Roethlisberger, which is obviously the best lineup construction on paper, then maybe you take some different value plays than other people are taking, where the value plays, there's a lot more variance that comes into play. There are, a higher likelihood that the high-owned value play fails than that Roethlisberger fails. So I think that is a good way to differentiate is build this chalky lineup and then go off the board on your value plays. With that said, I'll be looking for a way to pivot off these guys altogether. That doesn't mean I won't end up on all three of them because, again, they are clearly the best plays on paper. So, Bobby, what are your thoughts on this Pittsburgh offense? Anything that Grant and I are missing?
I think that they're pretty easy to fade on DraftKings just because the pricing is so absurd.
Yeah, that's what I want to hear.
Yeah, the pricing is absurd. This Miami defense has shut them down once as well as anybody has all year. Yeah, that was in Miami, so it's a little bit different. They're obviously much better at home, especially Roethlisberger. I do think that Rodgers is viable. I think the pricing is so absurd on the other on Le'Veon, and I get it, but I just feel like if you want to have a really solid lineup construction, it's harder in the playoffs to find your Paul Richardsons out there to save unless you're going to play 2 tight ends, which I think is the viable option to do this week. But I mean, it's just not a spot that I want to look at. I also think everybody's draft percentage is not going to correlate well to like anything for GPPs for me. There's not really none of those guys are going to differentiate me in any way. I do believe the chalk is the chalk, but I think in this particular case, I'm okay with fading this game because I think Miami is better defensively than they're a decent defensive team. I think Detroit. I mean, there's no question Pittsburgh's going to put up some points, but I feel like it's not a spot you actually have to rely on. Having said that, I do think that it's fine if you want to go there. Nothing wrong with being chalky. It's just in this particular situation, I think you can fade this game just due to pricing, if nothing else.
Grant, any thoughts on that?
I think the last time they played Miami was the game where Roethlisberger injured his knee. I can't quite remember if you guys maybe can when he hurt it in that game, but that could have had some of the reason why he was doing bad. I don't remember watching that game.
Late third quarter.
Late third quarter. All right. So, yeah, he wasn't looking great before that. But, again, that was on the road. But, yeah.
I think the viability here is so, like, for me this last weekend on my main team, I faded Jordy because I liked Julio and DeAndre Hopkins and some other low-owned guys just as much as I liked Jordy. I faded Kelsey because I liked Ertz more. I faded David Johnson just because I wanted to differentiate, and there were some cheap running backs I liked, and he was 50% owned and got hurt. That wasn't like a skill play to not have David Johnson, but it does remind you that, just because these guys are priced where they're priced doesn't create any certainty that they will get the production. Anything can happen. A guy could get ejected from a game, a guy could get injured. In the age of concussions where guys, have to leave the game, running back can get concussed. It can happen. So, I mean, that can't be your sole reason for fading Le'Veon Bell. You also, like, for me, I liked Mark Ingram and Thomas Rawls as much as David Johnson. I was wrong on Rawls, obviously, but, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to fade this guy to fade him. You have to also like other plays. I think that was one of the best things I've learned from Dave Potts. Cheese is Good. He talked about that on a baseball show he and I did together, was you always have to have a pivot. If you're fading a guy, you have to have another guy you like just as much, or just as much in a point per dollar sense. Or as Bobby alluded to, a roster construction you like just as much, where you say everybody's going to have these 3 expensive guys and then take some value guys to fill in. Well, what if I build a mid-tier lineup? But yeah, there is a lot that comes into it. I think we can all agree, though, that on paper they're the best players. Would you agree with that, Bobby?
I think you could make an argument for Odell this week. But
oh, yeah, absolutely. But I just mean like that actual stack, or that's the clearest path to points.
That's what I think that is, probably the clearest path to points. It's not a great week, so yes.
Yeah, and it's all, yeah, like you said, it's not a great week. We have 2 low-scoring projected games, and then we have a game against an elite Giants defense that is also kind of interesting. So, what about Miami's side, Bobby? Talk to me about Miami. Anything you see to like there with Matt Moore potentially at quarterback? Ryan Tannehill could come back. Does that change anything for you? What do you think?
It's hard for me to like. It's hard for me to like an offense that Matt Moore is quarterbacking. I didn't like it when he quarterbacked UCLA. I don't like it any better now. But if there is one guy to target, it would be Jarvis. They seemed to go back to him a lot last week. I think he had 12 targets, and he's to me an interesting play in this kind of a game. If Pittsburgh gets up big, which I think they may, if they get up just multiple scores and they're playing that way most of the game, you'd think that Landry would be more and more involved. So I like him. I don't think I'm going to go to Ajayi at all. I think it's Landry for me, and that's just about it.
Yeah, I think the way to think here is if you are taking the Steelers, you have to take a piece of the Dolphins pass game because they're a run-heavy team that's priced according to what they've done throughout the season. And if they are forced to go pass heavy, if you think that the Steelers are going to win everybody the tournaments, even at high ownership, then you're thinking the Steelers are putting up some serious points, which means you really have to include some Dolphins in there. Whether it's Jarvis Landry, whether it's Kenny Stills, who Matt Moore has looked to a lot. Not a great matchup for him, but just game theory wise, you can't expect the Steelers to win you tournaments without the Dolphins also having to get aggressive through the air and becoming valuable. I'm with you on Ajayi as well. I don't think I have interest there. He just hasn't looked good against any team but Buffalo for the last couple months since Pouncey went out. So Grant, what's your take on Miami?
Not many people are going to have interest in Ajayi, so I have interest in him if you don't take any of the Steelers, because the way that he's going to get a significant workload is most likely going to be in a game where Pittsburgh doesn't do a whole lot on offense. So I think that he's an interesting play if you're not playing any of the Pittsburgh guys or not playing many of the Pittsburgh guys. So you can go there. Yeah, I don't like his offensive line as of late, and I don't like what he's done against anyone but Buffalo for the last month, but that's fine. By the way, Matt Moore went to Oregon State, not UCLA. Burn, Bobby. But yeah, I'd say if you're going to stack Pittsburgh, go with Landry on the other side too in a lot of them.
Any interest in Kenny Stills if Matt Moore plays?
Yeah, I've got some interest in him. How much is he? I can't remember off the top of my head.
He's 3,800. He had 7 targets last week, 8 targets the week before. I think he's ascended above Devontae Parker in this offense. And I think that he's a kind of game-breaking type of talent, type of player where he could put up, 15 points on one long play. So definitely worth keeping in mind. But yeah, I agree as a whole. It's not a beautiful spot, but and I don't really see any super values on Miami, but definitely some things to keep in mind. Bobby, any final thoughts on Miami before we move on?
Well, yeah, I just want to say Matt Moore started his career at UCLA and then transferred when he couldn't stay the starter because he wasn't good enough. Transferred to
burn me right back, Bobby. Oh, man. Look at this. Look, shots fired.
Hey, you can talk NFL if you want, but this is college football. That's my territory. So go ahead.
I just know my old roommate's sister used to date him when he was at Oregon State, and he'd come over and play Madden and play with himself on Madden. And every time he throw a touchdown, see, I did that. Is allegedly a story I heard.
Oh man, it makes me like their past time.
Yes. Yeah, I gotta roster Matt Moore now this weekend. Even if Tannehill comes back and Moore is on the bench, I'm rostering him. 25-cent team. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna roster Matt Moore. I'll screenshot it and send it to you guys if I remember. Okay, so last game, and I got to return to the very first podcast we did where Bobby and I talked about the Giants being a good defense, and Grant argued that they weren't. He got a bunch of hate on Twitter about it. Then the Giants had some bad games, and Grant looked really good for that. Now at the end of the season, the Giants are, I believe, 3rd best in the NFL in scoring defense. Maybe they moved up to 2nd best after last weekend. DVOA, they're ranked 4th against the pass, 3rd against the run. regardless of whether Grant was right at the beginning of the year or not, this is now an absolutely elite defense. I mean, they're ranked second in overall DVOA behind only Denver. Very difficult to move the ball on, difficult to score points on. So this elite Green Bay offense at home. I mean, what are your thoughts, Grant? Do you side with Aaron Rodgers in the playoffs, or do you side with the matchup? Do you still need some time to unravel this? What are you thinking?
So, I mean, I still have to look into this more, but one thing to keep in mind is that this is Aaron Rodgers at home, which he is significantly better at home. I can't remember exactly what he's done in the past in the playoffs, but he's faced some decent defenses as of late. He put up 3 touchdowns against Seattle. I think that might have been the game where – am I looking at the right year? That might have been the game where Thomas got injured, or maybe that was the week before or after. I don't know, but he also put up good numbers against Minnesota, who, their pass defense isn't as great as it used to be, but it's still a decent pass defense. He's put up good numbers against good teams, especially at home. So I think that's something to take into account, that people are going to be off him a little bit more than they should be because he's going up against an elite Giants defense. But it's also Aaron Rodgers at home, and he can put up points on anyone at any given time. So I like him.
One thing to interject there is I think it'll be interesting to pay attention to ownership. I saw something, maybe it was on Roto World or somewhere, that mentioned that they expected him to be the highest. I don't remember where it was, but it was a source that I trust for just DFS thoughts. And they said they think he'll be the highest owned quarterback this weekend, even over Roethlisberger. But I think a lot of that will be contingent on chatter throughout the week. And again, if you're a premium subscriber, that'll all be taken into account in Jamino's projections. If you're not a premium subscriber, just pay attention to things, or like Grant said, enter a tournament on Saturday where it shows ownership percentages, because if Rodgers is going to go low owned because of the matchup, he becomes a lot more attractive because, like Grant said, I mean, he can put up points against anybody. And, this Giants defense is elite, but I used Kirk Cousins this last week thinking that, the Giants were going to rest players. They didn't, and Cousins had a disappointing fantasy game, but he still put up 287 yards. If he hadn't thrown a pick down the stretch, he's putting up over 300 yards with probably 2 touchdowns. And that's a solid game. Rodgers can do that and more. So definitely worth paying attention to ownership on this. So sorry to cut you off on that, Grant, but wanted to throw that in there. Any other thoughts on this side of the ball?
Just I'm fine with you cutting me off. I can never be angry at you, Jam. But Geronimo, I'm going to go call him Geronimo Allison. If Cobb doesn't play, he's in play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think after he won $1 million for our listener Josh this last weekend, people are obviously not going to overlook him if Cobb is out. But I do think that Allison is trust is a big thing with Aaron Rodgers. We've seen that throughout the years. And he literally talked after the game about, use the words trust, that he trusts Allison. And so, if Cobb's out, I think Allison becomes a very intriguing salary saver. And, a guy you could pair with Paul Richardson to go double salary saver and then pay up in other spots. Bobby, what are your thoughts on this Green Bay offense in a tough matchup against the Giants?
Even in a tough matchup, it's hard for me not to find this being the offense I'm targeting the most this week, just with how much they throw the ball and the potential targets. Jared Cook had 8 targets last week. I mean, everybody in this offense is in play. Montgomery will be the lowest owned, but probably intriguing just for that reason alone. He can do things catching the ball out of the backfield if they're playing in any sort of comeback situation. I don't think that their secondary is good enough to hang with a lot of the Giants receivers. So I actually think this game is going to end up being a lot higher scoring than you expect, because Rodgers, it doesn't matter how good the defense is, he'll keep the game close no matter what's happening on the other side of the ball. And I think that Green Bay will struggle to stop the Giants. So I think you're going to see a somewhat high scoring game here where I want to target the entire Green Bay side of the ball. And I'm interested in the Giants, especially OBJ. I think it's a great spot. It's a game that I'm definitely looking at targeting this week.
Yeah, I think that one thing we've seen with Jared Cook recently is his usage is very matchup specific. His snap rate has gone up drastically against teams that can't defend the tight end. He'll hover in the 30% range against teams that do well against defending the seam, and then he'll jump up to a 70% snap rate against these bad teams. And Giants are very much a bad team against the tight end. Let me check the exact numbers on this. So they rank top 7 against all 3 wide receiver positions in DVOA, but rank 26th against the tight end. Definitely the best way to attack this defense, and I think Cook makes a lot of sense this week, as does the passing game as a whole. Again, the Packers don't run the ball a lot. Rodgers is going to throw it, and he's going to have success. This offense looks as good as it has in a couple of years, so definitely a lot to like. And Bobby, I'm going to throw it back to you to see if there's anything on top of your OBJ love that you're interested in on the Giants side.
No, not specifically, but I couldn't hate any of the receiving plays. Probably not going to start Eli, but other than that, I could see an argument being made for most other plays. I just am not really interested in going that way myself.
Yeah, I think I was thinking this when you were talking a minute ago. I think that Eli is one of those players that we're going to see on a lot of sharp DFSers rosters. But I can think in my head about several players who I have a lot of respect for that I won't at all be surprised if I see Eli on one of their main rosters this week. Mm-hmm. With that said, I don't think it's the right play. Eli has been, and maybe I'll change my tune later in the week, but it's not an accident that Eli has seen his numbers down this far for this much of this season. And I get the argument in that he'll be low owned going against one of the worst pass defenses in football. I could see it on a cheaper entry, but not on a main team, not in a higher dollar entry. My take on Eli at the moment. Grant, what's your thoughts on the Giants offense and on Eli Manning?
So I think OBJ is obviously in play. Ended up leading the league in targets this year. So you can play him. I need to look into research more Paul Perkins and Rashad Jennings, but as of right now, it doesn't look like I have interest in either of them. But one thing to keep in mind for Eli is he could be throwing a lot if they have to come from behind. And, I mean, he's had a few 3-4 touchdown games this season. Like, he can put up big games or he can put up bad games. But you also have to look at his road playoff appearances over the last 6-8 years, and he's put up some good ones. So I hate going off of that narrative like, oh, he's a clutch game-time player. But it's proven true again and again, like that he can do well in the playoffs and he can do well on the road. And this is a really poor Packers pass D, and so I think you have to consider him, and I can see some real relevant reasons for playing him in this scenario. But it would be a bad idea just to do a full game stack on this at all either.
Yeah, and I mean, like Levitan always says, OBJ can take a slant 60 yards to the house. I mean, that's basically how he scores most of his touchdowns. Well, if he does that 2 times, all of a sudden Eli's looking a lot better. Grant, to your point about them maybe having to pass a lot. I mean, he threw 63 times in week 16 against Philadelphia. That turned into 1 touchdown and 3 picks. But again, if OBJ takes a couple slants to the house and if he dumps off something else, you end up with 3 touchdowns. I don't think I can go there, but I do think it's a very interesting play in this spot. And on Perkins and Rashad Jennings, they've tried to go more run heavy. Packers run defense, I think we all agreed early in the season when they were, number 1 in yards per attempt, number 1 in DVOA, we all said that we thought they were like a top 10 or 12 defense, which is right where they ended up. But again, not an elite run defense, not bad, but definitely attackable. I think if there are any whispers as to who's actually going to see the work between Perkins and Jennings, if it's Jennings, I wouldn't be interested because he's just not good. If it's Perkins, I would have some interest if he's going to see 20-plus touches this week. So, Bobby, any final thoughts on this game or on this slate before we move on to some bold calls?
No, I think we just about covered it. I'm pretty into targeting that game, and I made that clear.
All right. So we have some punishment to dole out, and I had to get permission from Grant to have this be his tweet. If you are a longtime listener, you know that things that would embarrass normal people don't embarrass Grant at all because they're things he would post on Twitter anyway. passing out drunk and waking up thinking of a rug as a flying carpet, buying live lobsters and taking them into the bathtub while giving himself bubble bath boobs, loving Nickelback, etc., are all things that Grant is not embarrassed by. So since he gave me 4 consecutive awful tweets, I got my family's help over the holidays, explained who Grant is as a person, and got their help coming up with an embarrassing tweet for him. So this is it. Grant has conceded to post this. For new listeners, the rules are Grant cannot give any indications that this is a joke, although I may have to rescue him as he did with my Tom Brady and Seahawks tweet. But the tweet is, no one should ever feel like they are above asking for help. I'm looking into online counseling. Any tips on where to take the first step? So look for that tweet from Grant. What are you thinking, Grant? Tomorrow, Tuesday afternoon?
Yeah, I'm gonna wait until the podcast comes out, so at least some people will know it's not a joke. But kids, feel free to razz me real good, because I can take it. Unlike this Bobby Fee and JM guy, who have both either buried the tweet in a whole bunch of other ones when he first posted it, Bobby, or kind of let out the bag that he lost a bet, even though that one I completely understood and bailed you out. But
I've tried to bury the tweets as well. I tweet like 5 times a week, and I've had tweets where it's like my embarrassing tweet and then 7 straight tweets about football stuff to try to knock it down a little bit. But yeah, Grant, if it gets as bad as the Tom Brady Seahawks one, which seemed to be threatening my career as people wondered whether I knew anything about football, with the tweet starting out saying Tom Brady looks awful this year. But yeah, if it gets bad, I'll swoop in and rescue you. But it should be fun for a day.
I don't think you need to.
No, considering it's you, I don't think I need to at all. I'm assuming you will just love it more than anything to see people taking it seriously.
Yeah, I'd get a good. I'm gonna probably get a good chuckle out of it. I will admit.
So this leaves us now with bold calls to make. Playoff edition. I'm kind of thinking that we should restrict it to cheaper plays and go with a bold call for somebody. It doesn't have to be exactly under 5K, but just somebody in that range. And we could all compare point per dollar on the guys. So I can go first if you guys want me to.
Okay.
And I will go with Kenny Stills as a better point per dollar play than whoever you guys pick, and fully expect to lose since that's a boomer bust play. But if he hits one long touchdown, I'll be in great shape. So I'll go Kenny Stills at 3,800. Grant, who do you have?
I'm gonna go Paul Richardson because.
Well, that's just easy.
Okay, fine. I'll do something. Bobby, you go. I'm gonna do something weird. Anquan Bolden. Bobby, you're still on mute.
Ooh, I like
I
the Anquan Bolden one.
I was giving you a chance to say Anquan Bolden before I.
You want him? I'll go with something else.
I don't know if it's really a bold call and it's not a wide receiver. Does that count? Wait, are we just doing wide receiver?
Are you going to say Jared Cook? Because I feel like Jared Cook and Paul Richardson have to be off limits.
Okay, fine. I can't say Jared Cook.
Do you agree? You guys agree? I mean, those are the two guys that will
that's
that are going to be like sharp plays. Like who could just go off that 5% own, something like that in this range?
3 to 5%. Jesus.
Well, I mean,
Christ.
just people that people don't want. Like I would take Marvin Jones as an acceptable answer. Paul Perkins as an acceptable answer.
Wow. Oh man. Is
Anquan Bolden, Will Fuller? Yeah, Fuller's 4,400.
I don't want to even say him. Can I say Landry?
Jarvis Landry? What is he priced at?
51.
He's 5,100. I'm not giving him that.
Fine.
I mean,
fine. You know what? I'll make a bold call. I just don't like any of these bold predictions.
Take Ladarius Green. Hey, you want Kenny Stills? I'll let you have Kenny Stills. I'll take Will Fuller.
I don't like him either. No, you know what? I'm gonna go to I'm gonna go to Will Fuller. I'll go with Fuller.
All right. If you want to swap with either of us,
no,
we'll
you know what?
let you.
I'm taking Shepard. Shepard's gonna be the best anyway. Actually, Shepard makes more sense.
I like that one. I like that one a lot. Okay, Sterling Shepard. Point per dollar. Sterling Shepard, Anquan Bolden, and Kenny Stills. I'd say Bolden is the one I'm likeliest to actually roster, but I'm now interested to dig into the Shepard
Yeah.
idea. Definitely one that we overlooked and that most people will, in that they'll be going to Bolden and then won't want both receivers. I think Shepard's a very interesting play there. Bobby, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Happy New Year to everyone. Hopefully this year is better than the last in every way for all of you, no matter how great your last year was. Hope it keeps getting better, and if it was terrible, it can only go up. So here's to a new year, and it's great doing the show with you guys, and I'm glad we got another one in.
Now that Bobby has uplifted us, Grant, what do you have for closing thoughts?
Just thoughts from my New Year's night. Don't take candy from strangers. Don't give hefty middle-aged women piggyback rides downstairs. And if you come out of a drunk and realize I should not be dancing with this lady, just walk away.
It's okay to walk away. It's very good advice. I believe we will be back next week for one last show. If not, listeners, you will be surprised that we're not here, just as you were last week. So thanks for hanging out with us. Bobby, Grant, thanks for doing the show. And we will catch you, I think, next week. And we'll catch you at the top of the leaderboards this weekend.
See you, kids.